I am Joshua, 26, and my parents told me I was not smart enough for science. They funded my brother's expensive pre-med education and handed me a brochure for a local auto detailing academy. Before I tell you how I went from washing cars to holding a multi-million-dollar medical patent that forced my bankrupt parents to beg on their knees, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. 4 years ago, on a cold Tuesday evening, the air in my family's pristine suburban kitchen smelled like roasted turkey and expensive wine. We lived in a wealthy neighborhood where appearances were everything. My father, Robert, sat at the head of the heavy marble island. He was a corporate executive who valued status above all else. He was holding his silver fountain pen, signing a stack of financial documents. My older brother, Caleb, sat across from him wearing a crisp university sweatshirt. Caleb was the golden child. He looked like a prince who had just been handed the keys to the kingdom. I stood near the sink. I was holding a co-signed loan application for the State University Biochemistry program. I was not asking them for a free ride. I just needed a guarantor so I could take on the debt myself. I placed the application on the marble counter right next to my father's coffee mug. I told him the deadline for the financial aid office was Friday and that if he just signed the bottom line, I would handle the rest of the financial burden. He did not even look at the paper. He did not pick up his pen. Instead, he opened his leather briefcase, pulled out a glossy trifold pamphlet, and slid it directly over my university application. He pushed it across the smooth marble toward me. The cover featured a man smiling brightly while holding a high-pressure buffer next to a shiny sports car. The bold letters at the top read, Advanced Auto Detailing and Automotive Care Academy. I stared at the brochure. I asked him what this was. Robert folded his hands on the table and looked me dead in the eye. He told me that science requires a certain caliber of intellect. He said Caleb had it and I did not. He stated very clearly that he and my mother were not going to facilitate a fantasy that ended with me dropping out and ruining my credit score. He had just finished writing an $85,000 check for Caleb's college fund at Johns Hopkins, but he refused to sign a piece of paper for me. I looked at my mother, Martha. She was wiping down the spotless counter, pretending she did not hear the insult. I told her I had a 3.8 GPA and that I was taking advanced placement biology. She paused her cleaning and offered me this tight, patronizing smile. She called me sweetheart and told me that auto detailing was a perfectly fine career for a boy like me. She said I was always good at keeping my old truck clean. She asked why I would force myself into a stressful academic environment where I simply could not compete. Caleb smirked into his water glass. He did not say a word. He did not have to. I did not scream. I did not throw the brochure back in their faces. The anger I felt was too cold for tears. I took the pamphlet, walked upstairs to my bedroom, and pulled 2 duffel bags from the closet. I packed my clothes, my science books, and my small savings jar. I walked out the front door that same night without saying goodbye. I knew arguing with them was a waste of breath. 2 years later, Robert was sitting in his leather armchair in his private study, sipping an expensive glass of scotch. He loved to pretend he was an intellectual equal to the doctors at his country club, so he kept subscriptions to prestigious medical journals. He opened the latest quarterly issue of the New England Journal of Medicine to read about a groundbreaking new cellular degradation pathway for resistant tumors. He scanned the dense methodology, feeling a surge of arrogant pride just for understanding the abstract. Then he reached the top of the page. He saw the authorship credits printed in bold black ink. Lead researcher, Joshua Davis. His hands started shaking violently. The heavy crystal glass slipped from his grip. The amber scotch spilled across his polished mahogany table and soaked into his expensive Persian rug. He pulled out his phone and dialed my mother. His voice was entirely hollow when she answered. He just kept repeating, "That is his name, Martha. That is his name. But right now, I need to take you back to the grueling years before that moment. I need to tell you exactly how the guy washing cars managed to rewrite the rules of modern oncology and suffocate their arrogance. After walking out of my parents' house, I rented a windowless room above a commercial dry cleaner on the gritty edge of the city. The air in that apartment always tasted faintly of industrial starch and vehicle exhaust. But it was mine. It was the first space in my life that did not belong to Robert and Martha Davis. I had no safety net. I had 2 duffel bags and a quiet, burning need to prove my mind was worth something. To pay my rent and my tuition, I took a job at a high-end auto detailing shop downtown. My parents had handed me that brochure as an insult, but I used the industry to fund my own reality. 6 days a week, I worked 9-hour shifts. I scrubbed the wheels of customized Porsche 911s. I applied chemical wax to pristine Ferraris and Lamborghinis owned by men who wore watches that cost more than my entire yearly salary. My hands were perpetually stained with degreaser and harsh chemical solvents. The skin around my knuckles cracked and bled from the constant exposure to hot water and synthetic cleaners. The physical exhaustion was a heavy, suffocating blanket that settled over my shoulders by 5 in the afternoon every single day. Sometimes, wealthy people from my parents' country club would bring their luxury cars into the shop. They would hand me their keys, recognize my face, and offer me a tight smile full of pity. They would ask how my parents were doing and mention how proud the entire neighborhood was of Caleb going off to a prestigious pre-med program at Johns Hopkins. I would just smile, scrub their custom rims, and nod. I let them think whatever they wanted to think. Because the moment my shift ended, I stripped off my grease-stained uniform, took a city bus across town, and walked into the harsh fluorescent light of the community college science building. The night classes were filled with people like me, people who worked double shifts, who had bruised hands and tired eyes, but who took meticulous notes until 10 at night. I registered for every advanced chemistry and cellular biology prerequisite the college offered. I did not have the luxury of failing. During my second semester, my organic chemistry professor, a stern man named Professor Carter, handed back our midterm exams. The class average was a 54. I scored a 99. He kept me after class that evening. He did not coddle me or offer empty praise. He looked at my exam paper and asked why I was wasting my time at a 2-year college when my spatial understanding of molecular structures was better than most graduate students he had taught. I told him I was transferring. He wrote me a glowing letter of recommendation that same night. By the end of my second year, I had maintained a flawless 4.0 grade point average. I applied directly for the accelerated biochemistry program at the State University and submitted a secondary application for a highly competitive undergraduate research spot in the oncology department. I got the merit scholarship. I got the lab position. The financial burden was finally lifted. Thanksgiving was approaching, and my mother sent a formal invitation to dinner. I knew it was not a genuine olive branch. It was a summons. They wanted an audience for Caleb. I decided to go. I wanted to see the dynamic with clear eyes now that I possessed my own secret currency. The house smelled of expensive sage stuffing when I walked in. Robert sat at the head of the table swirling dark red wine. Caleb sat to his right, looking arrogant and well-rested. His hands were perfectly manicured and soft. My knuckles were dry, and a faint shadow of engine grease still clung to my left thumbnail. For the first hour, I was practically invisible. The entire conversation was an orchestrated performance centered on Caleb. He complained theatrically about the grueling demands of his Ivy League organic chemistry labs. He casually dropped medical jargon into his stories to sound authoritative. He mispronounced a term related to cellular apoptosis. I noticed it immediately. Any freshman biology student would have noticed it, but my father just nodded along with deep reverence. Caleb leaned back and sighed, claiming the professors at Hopkins expected a caliber of intellect that most people just could not sustain. My mother patted his arm, her eyes shining with pride, telling him he was carrying the family legacy. Then Aunt Clara, who always loved to stir the pot, looked across the table at me. She smirked and asked how the car washing business was going. She asked if I was keeping the local Rolls-Royces nice and shiny. Robert laughed. He offered a mocking smile and asked if I had mastered the complex science of the perfect wax job. I just picked up my fork, met his gaze, and said I was learning a lot. The following October, I drove back to that house on a Tuesday afternoon to retrieve my heavy winter coats from my old closet. I knew my parents would be out. I used my old brass key and walked into the pristine kitchen. On the marble island, there was a disorganized stack of mail. One thick envelope from the Johns Hopkins University academic registrar caught my eye. It was torn open. I pulled the heavy parchment from its sleeve. It was an academic dismissal. Caleb had not just failed a single class. He had been placed on academic probation a year ago. He had failed 3 consecutive semesters of foundational pre-med coursework. The university was formally terminating his enrollment. Last November, when he was bragging at the Thanksgiving table about the Ivy League pressure, he was actively drowning. He built a fortress of lies, and my parents applauded his performance. Just then, the garage door opened. Robert and Martha walked in. They saw me holding the letter. I thought the truth would level the playing field. I thought Robert would look at the wreckage of his massive investment and realize his hierarchy was a fraud. I was wrong. Robert snatched the paper from my hands. He built a brick wall of denial right in front of my face. He used his corporate tone and stated that the traditional academic structure was far too rigid for a visionary mind like Caleb's. He claimed Caleb was taking a sabbatical to launch an innovative biotech startup. He was willing to fund a blatant lie rather than acknowledge a single uncomfortable truth. Martha hissed at me. She accused me of sneaking into their home just to tear down the one person in our family destined for greatness. I realized right then that we did not share a reality. I told them they could keep the winter coats. I walked out to my car, requested a permanent change to my phone number, and severed the digital cord. I erased their ability to reach me ever again. I drove back toward the gritty industrial skyline of the city. I was heading to the laboratory. Science does not lie. Science does not play favorites. It only rewards the truth. And I was about to dive so deep into the truth that the entire medical world would have no choice but to learn my name. The transition from the community college to the State University Oncology Research Center was a trial by fire. I spent my days analyzing resistant cellular structures and my nights reviewing clinical data until the text blurred on the screen. My life was stripped down to the bare essentials. I had no social life, no days off, and barely enough money to cover my groceries. But I possessed a quiet, relentless focus. My hands were no longer stained with car grease. They were calloused from handling microscopic pipettes and sterile glass slides. The main laboratory was a vast expanse of stainless steel tables, humming centrifuges, and glowing computer monitors. This was the domain of Dr. Samuel Gray. He was a pioneer in targeted cellular immunotherapy and the most demanding human being I had ever met. He possessed zero patience for ego or fragility. He did not care about my family pedigree. He only cared about precision, discipline, and verifiable data. There was a senior graduate student in the lab named Wyatt. Wyatt was a legacy kid whose parents had donated a wing to the library. He hated me. He found out about my background and constantly made snide remarks about the auto detailer playing with expensive microscopes. He tried to dump his grunt work on me and routinely attempted to take credit for my data logging. I never complained. I just worked harder. I worked double shifts running assays and logging molecular reactions. When the winter holidays rolled around, I spent Christmas Eve charting protein structures while eating stale crackers from the vending machine. I poured every ounce of the rejection from my childhood directly into those petri dishes. Our primary project focused on resistant lymphoma cells. We were trying to understand why certain aggressive tumors possessed the ability to repel targeted immune system attacks. The failure rate of our experiments was staggering. Weeks of preparation would routinely end in dead cells and useless data. It broke the spirits of graduate students like Wyatt. But I was immune to that kind of frustration. A failed experiment in a lab was nothing compared to the daily failure of trying to earn my father's respect. It happened on a quiet Tuesday night in late March. The clock on the wall read 3:14 in the morning. The laboratory was entirely empty except for me. I was running a routine screening on a new batch of resistant cells we had introduced to an experimental synthetic enzyme. I prepared the glass slide, placed it carefully under the electron microscope, and leaned forward to look through the dual lenses. I adjusted the focus knob. I expected to see the tumor cells remain intact, deflecting the enzyme just as they had done 100 times before. But the image on the screen was wrong. The cells were not just dying. The structural protein chains were unraveling in a rapid, sequential cascade. It looked like a microscopic zipper being pulled apart. The synthetic enzyme was triggering a specific receptor that caused the tumor to dismantle its own defenses from the inside out. It was a domino effect nobody in our department had ever theorized. My heart slammed against my ribs. I pulled back from the microscope. The ghost of my father entered my mind. His booming voice whispered that I was making a rookie mistake, that I was just a car washer looking at a contaminated sample. I refused to let his voice win. I forced my breathing to slow down. I stood up, walked to the sterile containment hood, and prepared a second sample from scratch. I measured the chemical reagents with agonizing precision. I placed the new slide under the lens. The exact same unraveling sequence occurred. I ran the assay a third time using an entirely different control batch. The data was undeniable. I reached into my pocket and called Elijah, a brilliant data analyst and the only loyal friend I had in the department. I woke him up and told him to get to the lab immediately to verify the numbers. I knew if I left the data unattended, Wyatt would find a way to claim he structured the trial. Elijah arrived 20 minutes later, looked at the sequence, and just stared at me in pure shock. Then I dialed Dr. Gray's personal number. Calling a department head before dawn was a fast way to get terminated if the emergency was not genuine. He answered, his voice thick with sleep and irritation. I kept my voice steady. I told him the protein chains were degrading from the inside. The irritation vanished. He ordered me not to touch the sample and arrived 30 minutes later. Dr. Gray walked straight past my desk and sat down at the electron microscope. He looked through the lenses for 10 full minutes in profound silence. He switched the digital display to the secondary monitor to review the numerical decay rates. The tension in his shoulders dropped. He took off his reading glasses, turned around, and looked at me with a quiet, profound respect. He asked if I understood what I had just found. This is the kind of discovery that triggers the dark side of academic medicine. In many prestigious institutions, a senior scientist or an entitled graduate student like Wyatt would steal the achievement and bury the undergraduate's name in the tiny acknowledgement section. My father would have done exactly that. But Dr. Gray stood up, walked over to the dry erase board, and erased a section of our scheduling notes. In large, bold letters, he wrote the title of our new subproject. Underneath the title, he wrote lead researcher, followed by my name. He stated firmly that I found the pathway, I verified the sequence, and it was my data. We were going to map every single variable, and then we were going to publish it. The validation hit me with the force of a tidal wave. I was not being erased to protect someone's fragile ego. I was being elevated because my work earned it. The terrified kid from the wealthy suburb truly disappeared in that moment. Over the next 6 months, our team worked with an intensity that bordered on obsession. We ran thousands of variations mapping the exact mechanism of the cellular degradation. We endured a barrage of audits from independent cellular biologists. Wyatt tried to file a formal grievance claiming he laid the groundwork for the enzyme mixture. But Dr. Gray shut him down instantly, presenting the time-stamped lab logs Elijah and I had secured. We submitted our final manuscript to the New England Journal of Medicine, and it was accepted without requested revisions. Meanwhile, back in his manicured neighborhood, Robert Davis was desperately trying to maintain his illusion of superiority. But the foundation of his kingdom was hemorrhaging cash. Caleb's fabricated biotech startup was nothing more than a black hole of debt. Caleb possessed no business acumen and zero scientific expertise. He had rented premium office space, hired a boutique marketing firm, and spent his days attending expensive networking lunches while producing absolutely zero tangible products. To fund this charade, Robert and Martha had quietly liquidated a massive portion of their retirement portfolio. They had taken out a secondary mortgage on their pristine house. They even consulted a lawyer to figure out how to shield their remaining assets from business creditors. They were drowning in the consequences of betting their entire legacy on the wrong child. But Robert refused to show a single crack in the facade. He doubled down on his pretentious habits at the country club, discussing medical advancements with surgeons just to feed his ego. It was an early autumn afternoon when the quarterly issue of the New England Journal of Medicine arrived in his mailbox. Robert walked into his private study, a room lined with leather-bound volumes he never read. He poured himself that glass of single malt scotch, sat in his leather armchair, and opened the journal. He intended to find a dense article on cellular biology to vaguely reference during his golf game. He found the headline feature, a novel pathway in targeted T-cell immunotherapy. He read the abstract, mouthing the complex terminology, genuinely impressed by the scope of the data. Then his eyes dropped to the authorship credits. Joshua Davis, lead investigator. The physical reaction was visceral. His mind desperately tried to reject the visual information. He tried to tell himself it was a common name. He tried to tell himself the son he had chased out of his house for being a mediocre liability could not possibly be the architect of a medical revolution. But when he opened his laptop and searched the State University faculty directory, my high-resolution photograph loaded on his screen. I was wearing a crisp white lab coat, looking directly into the camera with a calm, confident smile. The illusion he had spent his entire life building collapsed in a matter of seconds. The glass shattered, and people like my father do not simply walk away from broken glass. They try to sweep it up and claim they built the window. 7 days later, the State University Research Institute hosted its annual clinical symposium. This was a sprawling architectural marvel of tempered glass and acoustic wood paneling designed specifically to host industry titans. The tiered seating was filled with senior pharmaceutical executives, venture capitalists, and the most distinguished oncologists on the Eastern Seaboard. Millions of dollars in research grants and medical patents were routinely negotiated in this room. I stood backstage in the quiet isolation of the green room, waiting for the opening remarks to conclude. I was wearing a tailored charcoal suit and a crisp white shirt. I looked down at my hands resting on my leather presentation portfolio. The chemical burns from the auto detailing shop were long gone. I felt a profound sense of calm. For years ago, I stepped into a bitter winter evening without a dollar to my name. Today, I was the keynote speaker at a global medical conference. Dr. Gray stood next to me. He adjusted the lapel of my suit and told me to go out onto that stage and show the medical establishment exactly what happens when they underestimate the quiet ones. The auditorium speakers crackled to life. Dr. Gray stepped up to the podium and announced that the revolutionary breakthrough did not come from a senior executive. It came from a relentless undergraduate investigator who refused to accept the standard parameters of failure. He called my name. I walked out from behind the heavy velvet curtain. The stage lights were blinding for a fraction of a second. I stepped up to the clear acrylic podium, adjusted the microphone, and set my digital remote on the slanted surface. The blinding haze faded, and the hundreds of faces in the tiered seating came into sharp focus. I scanned the audience to establish direct eye contact with the high-profile attendees in the front rows. My gaze swept across the left aisle, moving past a row of corporate investors. Then my eyes locked onto the center VIP section. Sitting in the second row, directly in my line of sight, were Robert, Martha, and Caleb. They were not supposed to be there. The symposium required exclusive pre-approved industry credentials. But Robert had bullied his way into the room, likely utilizing his corporate title and manufacturing an emotional story about being the proud father of the keynote speaker. He was sitting on the edge of his velvet seat, holding his smartphone up high, recording my every word. He looked around at the distinguished doctors near him, nodding along to my chemical explanations as if he had personally taught them to me. He wanted the elite crowd to associate my brilliance with his genetics. Martha sat next to him wearing her designer pearls, clapping her hands in exaggerated awe every time I clicked to a new slide. It was a flawless theatrical performance of maternal devotion. And then there was Caleb. The older brother looked like he was attending a funeral. The tailored designer suit he wore hung loosely on his shrinking frame. His skin was pale, his posture rigid and defensive. He stared at the floorboards, looking physically ill. The ultimate golden child was forced to watch the brother he mercilessly mocked deliver a masterclass to the global medical elite. The psychological conditioning of my childhood tried to pull me backward for one dangerous second. But I gripped the edges of the clear acrylic podium. I grounded myself. I was not standing in their pristine suburban kitchen anymore. I was standing in my arena. I looked directly into my father's camera lens, clicked to the next slide, and launched into the most complex statistical analysis of the entire study. I elevated my vocabulary. I spoke with a rapid, clinical precision that left zero room for doubt or misinterpretation. My voice echoed through the vast acoustic room, carrying clear and steady over the state-of-the-art sound system. I detailed the specific synthetic enzyme reactions and the receptor dismantling process. I watched senior surgeons nod in agreement. I saw pharmaceutical representatives taking frantic notes on their digital tablets. I built an impenetrable fortress of undeniable expertise right in front of my family's eyes. I proved that I did not just stumble into a lucky discovery. I proved that I owned the science. I finished the presentation with a concise summary of our upcoming human trials and the projected survival rates. I thanked the Research Institute and stepped back from the microphone. The response from the crowd was a physical force. The entire auditorium erupted. Hundreds of industry leaders, oncologists, and executives rose to their feet in unison. The standing ovation was deafening, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. I remained behind the clear podium for a few fleeting seconds, letting the noise wash over me. I gathered my presentation notes, sliding them neatly into my leather portfolio. My breathing was steady. The terrified kid who used to shrink under the weight of his father's disapproval no longer existed. I walked down the short flight of carpeted stairs leading from the stage to the main floor. The standing ovation began to dissolve into a frantic, chaotic scramble. Pharmaceutical representatives in tailored suits moved swiftly down the aisles, holding out glossy business cards. They wanted exclusive licensing rights. Dr. Gray stood at the bottom of the steps, acting as a formidable barrier between me and the encroaching corporate investors. Then the crowd shifted. The polite, professional murmur of the medical elite was abruptly pierced by a booming, theatrical voice. "Make way, please. Excuse me. That is my son up there." I turned my head. Pushing through a cluster of distinguished researchers was Robert Davis. He was not using subtle, refined navigation. He was shoving his way forward, utilizing his broad shoulders and his expensive corporate suit to bully the intellectuals out of his path. He wanted the surrounding billionaires to witness his arrival. Martha followed closely in his wake. Her face stretched into a wide, desperate smile that did not reach her eyes. "Our son, the genius," Robert announced, projecting his voice so loudly it bounced off the ceiling. He breached the inner circle of investors surrounding Dr. Gray and me. He opened his arms wide, a grandiose gesture designed to force a public embrace. It was the exact posture he used when posing for photographs at his country club charity events. He calculated that the pressure of the prestigious crowd would force me to play the part of the grateful, adoring child. He assumed wrong. I did not flinch. I did not take a single step backward. As he lunged forward to wrap his arms around my shoulders, I simply raised my right hand. I locked my elbow and pressed my flat palm firmly against the center of his chest. The physical block was rigid, unyielding, and undeniably hostile. The impact stopped him dead in his tracks. His expensive leather shoes squeaked against the polished hardwood floor. The booming performative laugh died in his throat. The surrounding pharmaceutical representatives and university board members fell silent. The abrupt shift in the atmosphere was immediate and uncomfortable. I looked him directly in the eyes. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the exact same clinical, detached precision I had just used to describe decaying tumor cells. "What are you doing here, Robert?" I asked. The sound of his first name leaving my lips struck him like a physical blow. In 26 years, I had never called him anything other than Dad. Stripping him of that title in front of an audience of elite professionals was a calculated, undeniable demotion. His jaw slackened, the polished corporate facade cracked, revealing a sudden flash of genuine panic. He looked down at my hand, still pressing firmly against his sternum. He desperately tried to salvage the optics. "Joshua, sweetheart," he stammered, lowering his voice to a forced whisper. "We are celebrating you. We are your family." We flew across the state the moment we saw the journal publication. Mr. Nathan, a senior partner from a prominent venture capital firm, cleared his throat. He was standing less than 3 feet away, holding a glossy brochure outlining my cellular pathway data. He looked from my rigid, outstretched hand to my father's pale, sweating face. Mr. Nathan was trained to read leverage, and he clearly recognized that Robert held zero power in this dynamic. "Is there a problem here, Dr. Davis?" Mr. Nathan asked, addressing me with a title of profound respect. Robert flinched at the word doctor. He turned to the investor, a desperate, ingratiating smile stretching across his face. "No problem at all," he insisted, rushing to assert his dominance. "Just a private family celebration. I am Robert Davis. I funded his early education. We are exploring the commercial applications of his work together." It was a breathtaking lie. He was attempting to pitch himself as my financial backer to a billionaire. He was trying to monetize the very intellect he had mocked and discarded. I dropped my hand from his chest. The silence between us stretched tight and dangerous. I turned to the venture capitalist and offered a calm, professional smile. "There is no problem, sir," I stated smoothly. "Just some unexpected guests from my past. If you leave your card with my department head, we will review your licensing proposals next week." Mr. Nathan nodded, handed his card to Dr. Gray, and backed away, recognizing the cold dismissal. I turned back to Robert, Martha, and Caleb. Their desperation was a tangible, foul-smelling thing in the pristine air of the auditorium. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a raw, naked hunger for the influence I now possessed. "We are not having this conversation in the middle of an industry symposium," I said, my voice low and sharp as a scalpel. "Follow me." I turned my back on them. I did not check to see if they were following. I knew they would. They were starving for relevance, and I held the only key. I walked down the carpeted aisle toward the heavy soundproof doors of the private green room, leading them away from their desired audience and directly into a reality check they would never forget. This is a moment that changed everything, when I finally regained control of my life. Thank you for your patience in getting this far. You are amazing. Please help me like the video and leave a comment with the number 1 below so I know you've been with me this far. This will not only help more people find this story, but also let me know that my experiences are meaningful to someone. Your support is the biggest motivation for me to continue sharing the rest of this journey. The heavy oak door of the private green room clicked shut. The acoustic seal engaged, slicing off the roar of the symposium crowd and the frantic energy of the pharmaceutical representatives. The silence that filled the space was instantaneous and suffocating. The room was designed for high-profile guest speakers, featuring plush leather sofas, a sleek vanity mirror, and a glass table lined with expensive bottled water. It was a sterile, luxurious cage, and I had just locked my family inside it. The transformation was breathtaking to witness. The moment the audience vanished, the performative warmth evaporated from my parents' faces. Robert dropped the charismatic visionary patriarch routine in a fraction of a second. His broad shoulders stiffened. The ingratiating smile he had plastered on for the venture capitalists morphed into a hard, familiar scowl. He reached up and jerked his silk tie, loosening the knot with a rough, agitated motion. He was no longer the proud father basking in the glow of his brilliant son. He was the reigning monarch who had just been publicly embarrassed by a disobedient subject. Martha dropped her hands from her face. The manufactured tears of maternal pride dried up instantly. She smoothed the front of her designer blouse, her features settling into a tight, pinched mask of profound irritation. She looked around the pristine green room, inspecting the catered fruit platters and the plush upholstery with naked envy. She resented that I had access to a world she could only infiltrate through deceit. Caleb remained near the doorway, keeping his distance. Without the buffering presence of the symposium crowd, the severe deterioration of his physical health was undeniable. The tailored suit he wore hung off his frame like a borrowed costume. His cheekbones were sharp and hollow. The dark circles under his eyes spoke of chronic insomnia and relentless, unmanageable stress. He leaned against the soundproof wall, crossing his arms over his chest in a frail attempt to project authority. Robert took 2 heavy steps toward the center of the room. He planted his expensive leather shoes on the thick carpet, puffing out his chest. "Is that how you greet your family?" he snapped. His voice was a sharp, cracking whip. It was the exact tone he used to discipline me when I was a child. It was the frequency designed to trigger a deeply ingrained psychological reflex to make me lower my eyes, apologize, and submit to his narrative. "After everything we did for you," he continued, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "After the sacrifices we made to give you a respectable upbringing, you stand out there in front of my peers and treat me like a stranger. You disrespect me in front of industry leaders. You made me look like a fool, Joshua." I stood near the glass table, resting my leather portfolio on the smooth surface. I did not cross my arms. I did not shrink. I looked at the man who had slid an auto-detailing brochure across a marble island and told me I was destined to fail. "You made yourself look like a fool, Robert," I replied, my voice low and steady. "You walked into a restricted medical conference and tried to pitch yourself as my financial backer to a man who handles billion-dollar acquisitions. You don't even know what the cellular degradation pathway is." Caleb let out a bitter, hacking scoff from the corner of the room. He pushed himself off the wall, taking a step forward. His fragile ego could not handle the sight of his scapegoat brother commanding the room. He needed to diminish my achievement to protect his own collapsing reality. "Don't act like you are a doctor, Joshua," Caleb sneered. His voice was raspy, trembling with suppressed rage. "You are an undergraduate assistant. You got lucky. You probably washed the right test tube and some senior researcher put your name on a paper out of pity. Don't stand there and act like you are on my level. You wash cars." I looked at my older brother, the golden child, the supposed genius destined for Ivy League greatness. He lacked the fundamental scientific vocabulary to even comprehend the abstract of my publication, yet he possessed the audacity to call my discovery a fluke. Arguing with Caleb was a useless endeavor because his reality was constructed entirely of delusions. Instead, I reached down and unzipped the brass closure of my presentation portfolio. The soft metallic glide of the zipper was the only sound in the room. I slid my hand past the printed copies of my clinical trial data. I reached into a thin hidden compartment at the very back of the folder. My fingers brushed against a folded piece of glossy paper. I pulled it out. The pamphlet was 4 years old. The ink on the cover had faded slightly from age, and the edges were creased and worn from being carried in the bottom of my duffel bags. But the image of the man smiling with a high-pressure buffer remained perfectly clear. Advanced Auto Detailing and Automotive Care Academy. I walked across the plush carpet, bridging the distance between myself and my father. I stopped exactly 2 feet away from him, invading his personal space with calm, deliberate intent. I held out the folded glossy brochure. "Take it," I said. Robert looked down at my outstretched hand. His brow furrowed in genuine confusion. He reached out and took the pamphlet from my fingers. He opened the trifold paper, his eyes scanning the faded text. The realization hit him with the physical force of a freight train. The angry, flushed color drained from his face, leaving behind a stark, sickly white. His jaw slacked. The arrogant posture collapsed inward. He stared at the piece of paper. It was the ultimate physical proof of his profound failure as a parent and his catastrophic misjudgment of my intellect. "You did not do anything for me," I stated. Every word was a surgical strike. "You told me I lacked the caliber of intellect for science. You sat at that kitchen island and you funded Caleb's lies while you handed me an insult. You bet your entire legacy on the wrong child. I took a slow breath. I scrubbed wheels and breathed in toxic chemicals until my hands bled to pay for my college credits. I slept on a cot in a laboratory break room to secure my research position. I funded my own reality, Robert. You do not get to show up at the finish line and pretend you helped me run the race. Martha stepped forward. The anger on her face dissolved, replaced by the familiar, manipulative tactic she used whenever she felt cornered. Her eyes welled with fresh tears. Her lower lip began to tremble. She reached out with both hands, attempting to grasp my arm. "Joshua, please," she whimpered, her voice cracking. "We made a mistake. We were blind. We were trying to protect you from the crushing disappointment of a demanding field. We are your parents. You cannot speak to us this way. We love you." I took a deliberate step backward out of her reach. Her manicured hands grasped empty air. "Stop, Martha," I commanded. My tone was devoid of any emotion. "Those tears do not work on me anymore. You do not love me. You love the influence I just secured in that auditorium. You love the pharmaceutical investors who were handing me their business cards. You only love what you can use." Robert crushed the auto-detailing brochure in his fist. His eyes darted frantically around the sterile green room, looking for an exit strategy. He looked at Caleb, standing pale and sweating in the corner. He looked at Martha, crying genuine tears of frustration because her manipulation had failed. Then he looked back at me. The final shreds of his pride burned away, leaving only a raw, terrifying desperation. The pink crushed paper fell from his hand, hitting the thick carpet with a dull thud. Robert adjusted his suit jacket, a frantic physical tic trying to restore a dignity that no longer existed. "We made a mistake," Robert said. His voice was raspy, stripped of its booming resonance. It was the first time in 26 years I had ever heard the man admit a flaw, but it was not a genuine apology. It was the opening line of a desperate negotiation. "We admit that you have proven yourself to be a formidable intellect. But we are family," he continued, his tone shifting into a calculated plea for solidarity. "And right now, this family is facing a catastrophic situation. We need your resources." Caleb let out a sharp, pathetic noise from the corner, a cross between a cough and a sob. He turned his face toward the soundproof wall. They were arguing like a bitter divorce over who got to keep the sinking ship, fighting for custody of my success. "Caleb's enterprise is struggling," Robert confessed. The words seemed to physically pain him. "The startup required staggering capital injections. We liquidated our primary retirement portfolios. We took out a secondary mortgage on the house. We are drowning, Joshua. You have the ear of every major pharmaceutical executive in that auditorium. If you endorse Caleb's company, if you introduce him to your investor network, we can secure emergency seed funding. You can save this family." I looked at the three of them. I felt a profound clinical detachment. I reached down and picked up my leather portfolio. I smoothed my hand over the dark grain of the cover. "I don't need to introduce him to my investor network," I said quietly. A sudden, desperate spark of hope ignited in my father's eyes when I said I didn't need to introduce Caleb to my investors. He mistook my calm tone for compliance. He thought the ingrained familial obligation had finally kicked in. He actually smiled. It was a greedy, relieved smile that completely transformed his harsh features. Martha took a rapid step forward, her hands clasped tightly together against her chest in breathless gratitude. "Thank you, Joshua," she breathed out, her voice fluttering with relief. "We knew you would understand. We knew you wouldn't let us lose the house." I held up my hand, locking my elbow and stopping her dead in her tracks. "I don't need to introduce him to investors," I clarified, my voice ringing with a cold, undeniable finality. "Because I don't need investors anymore. My patent was acquired yesterday morning." The silence that followed was so profound and heavy, I could hear the faint, mechanical hum of the air conditioning unit running through the ceiling vents. Caleb turned his head away from the soundproof wall, staring at me with wide, hollow eyes. Robert froze, his mouth falling slightly open. A multinational pharmaceutical conglomerate purchased the exclusive licensing rights to my targeted immunotherapy pathway. I continued, delivering the facts with precise surgical accuracy. They finalized the contract following a grueling 6-month due diligence period. The acquisition was executed for a high 7-figure sum. I watched the pure, unadulterated greed wash over their faces. It was a visceral, sickening transformation to witness in real time. The realization that their discarded, mocked son was now a verified millionaire wiped away their panic entirely. Robert straightened his posture. A hungry, calculating light sparked in his dark eyes. He saw a massive golden lifeline. He saw a sudden influx of capital that could erase his secondary mortgages, replenish his drained retirement accounts, and fund Caleb's delusions for another decade. He was probably already imagining Caleb's fake promotion to CEO of a newly funded branch of his imaginary biotech firm. "Joshua, that is staggering," Robert breathed out, a reverent awe slipping back into his authoritative tone. "My God, 7 figures. With that kind of capital, we can clear the debt immediately. We can restructure the family assets. We can hire a top-tier corporate lawyer to handle the creditors and get the bank off our backs." He was already spending my money in his head. He was treating my intellect and my grueling labor like it was his own personal inheritance. He was already planning exactly how to distribute my hard-earned victory to subsidize his massive failures. I unzipped the front pocket of my leather portfolio. I pulled out a single sheet of heavy, embossed legal paper. "There is no we, Robert," I stated. The hungry light in his eyes flickered and died instantly. "The capital from the patent acquisition is not sitting in a personal checking account," I explained, holding the document by the crisp edge. "The funds were transferred directly into a secured, irrevocable trust. I sat down with an estate lawyer 3 days ago to make sure this money was locked away forever." I stepped forward and handed the legal document directly to my father. He took it with trembling fingers. His eyes darted frantically across the dense legal typography. "The trust has 2 designated mandates," I told them, my voice echoing cleanly off the soundproof panels of the walls. "The first mandate allocates 60% of the capital to fund the permanent expansion of Dr. Gray's oncology laboratory. We are purchasing state-of-the-art electron microscopes. We are also establishing a permanent, high-paying salary fund to hire a dedicated team of undergraduate researchers, so kids who actually want to learn don't have to starve or exhaust themselves to death." Caleb let out a low, agonizing groan from the corner of the room. The money that could have saved his pristine suburban life, the money that could have paid off his massive fraudulent debts, was going to buy laboratory equipment for strangers. "The second mandate," I continued, turning my head and looking directly into my mother's tear-filled eyes, "allocates the remaining 40% to establish a permanent endowment, the Joshua Davis Foundation. It provides full-ride academic scholarships and housing stipends for underprivileged students entering the State University Biochemistry program." Robert stared at the paper. His hands shook so badly the embossed golden seal rattled against the stiff parchment. I locked eyes with my father. I delivered the final, unshakable truth. "I am using my wealth to fund the exact type of kids you tried to send to an auto detailing academy," I said. "Not a single cent of that 7-figure acquisition will ever touch your bank accounts. You will not see a dime to pay off your secondary mortgage. You will not see a penny to fund Caleb's fake networking lunches." Martha let out a sharp, devastated wail. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking with genuine, agonizing grief. She wasn't mourning a broken relationship with her youngest son. She was mourning the permanent loss of her pristine lifestyle, the country club memberships, the manicured lawns, and the illusion of superiority she had worn like a crown her entire life. Robert dropped the legal document. It fluttered to the floor, landing right next to the crumpled auto detailing brochure. The visual poetry of those 2 pieces of paper resting side by side on the thick carpet was undeniable. One represented the artificial limits they tried to place on my life. The other represented the boundless reality I had built despite them. You bet your entire legacy on the wrong child, I told them. That is your return on investment, not mine. I watched the architect of my childhood insecurities shatter into pieces. There was no argument left for him to make. There was no authority left for him to leverage. He was a broke, desperate man standing in the shadow of the son he had thrown away. Martha stumbled forward. Her expensive designer heels sank deep into the plush carpet. She stepped right over the crushed detailing brochure and the embossed legal trust document as if they were nothing but worthless trash. Her manicured hands reached out, trembling with a frantic, terrified energy. Her fingers clamped down hard on the sleeve of my tailored charcoal suit jacket. "Joshua, you cannot do this to us," she pleaded, her voice rising to a shrill, desperate pitch. "You cannot just walk away and leave us with this crushing debt. We raised you in a beautiful neighborhood. We put a solid roof over your head. We are your parents. You owe us your unwavering loyalty." I looked down at her pale, shaking hands gripping my dark fabric. I felt a fleeting echo of the old familiar fear. It was the deeply conditioned response of a child taught to obey his mother at all costs, to swallow his own discomfort, to maintain the family peace. But that fragile fear dissolved before it could even fully register in my mind. I reached over with my right hand and grasped her wrists. I did not shove her away. I merely applied a firm, unyielding pressure, peeling her desperate fingers off my jacket one by one. I let her hands drop back to her sides, severing the physical connection. "Biology makes us relatives, Martha," I stated, my voice echoing with a calm, definitive clarity. "Loyalty makes us family." I took a step back, putting a solid barrier of space between us. "You chose your loyalties 4 long years ago at a marble kitchen island. You chose to protect a fabricated illusion. You chose to fund a blatant lie instead of nurturing a verifiable truth. You do not get to demand loyalty from a son you ruthlessly discarded just because my success is now convenient for your survival." Robert stood paralyzed behind her. His broad chest heaved as he struggled to draw oxygen into his lungs. The formidable corporate titan, the neighborhood patriarch, the man who routinely commanded country club dining rooms, was reduced to a hollow, crumbling shell. He opened his mouth to issue a stern command, but no sound emerged from his throat. He possessed zero leverage over me. He possessed zero financial capital to exploit. The stark realization that he could no longer intimidate me broke the last remaining pillar of his fragile ego. He looked at the legal document resting on the floor and finally understood the profound permanence of his ruin. In the dim corner of the room, Caleb slid down the wall until he hit the floorboards. The ultimate golden child pulled his knees up to his chest, burying his pale face in his hands. He began to weep. It was not the performative crying of a manipulator trying to elicit sympathy. It was the ugly, jagged weeping of a man who knew his entire life was a fraudulent scheme that had just been dragged into the harsh, unforgiving light of reality. He would have to face the staggering weight of his bankrupt startup without the safety net of his parents' stolen retirement funds. His free ride was officially terminated. I picked up my leather presentation portfolio and tucked it securely under my arm. I looked at the 3 of them one last time, taking a vivid mental photograph of the wreckage they had built for themselves. "Do not attempt to contact me again," I warned them, my tone devoid of anger or malice. "I am instructing the university security detail to escort you out of this building immediately. If you try to bypass the front registration desk or access my laboratory in the future, I will file a formal trespassing injunction with my lawyer." I turned my back on Robert, Martha, and Caleb Davis. I reached for the heavy brass handle of the green room door. I pushed it open and stepped over the threshold. The acoustic seal broke, and the vibrant, thrumming energy of the medical symposium flooded over my senses. I let the heavy oak door click shut behind me, trapping the architects of my childhood misery in the suffocating silence of their own making. I walked down the long, carpeted corridor. My polished shoes clicked a steady, confident rhythm against the floor. I felt a profound physical lightness spreading through my chest. The invisible, heavy anchor I had dragged behind me for 26 years, the desperate, aching need to earn my father's approval, snapped and fell away forever. I was untethered. I was breathing clean air for the very first time in my adult life. I rounded the corner and entered the grand reception hall. The sprawling space was bathed in warm, golden light from towering crystal chandeliers. Waiters in crisp black uniforms moved gracefully through the massive crowd, carrying silver trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres and sparkling drinks. The room was packed with pharmaceutical investors, venture capitalists, and senior surgeons discussing the future of oncology. But I was not looking for lucrative corporate networking opportunities. I was not looking to rub shoulders with billionaires or secure my social status. I was looking for my authentic people. Standing near a sprawling arrangement of white orchids was Dr. Samuel Gray. He was surrounded by our dedicated laboratory team, including Elijah and the data analysts who had worked tirelessly through the night alongside me for 2 grueling years. They were not dressed in expensive tailored suits like my brother or my father. They wore practical blazers, slightly wrinkled shirts, and comfortable, worn shoes. They were the brilliant, exhausted, relentless minds that actually drove global scientific discovery forward. When Dr. Gray saw me approaching, his stern, intimidating face broke into a wide, brilliant smile. It was a rare sight, and it meant more to me than 1,000 standing ovations from a room full of executives. He reached over to a passing waiter and lifted 2 fluted glasses of champagne from the silver tray. He handed one directly to me. The rest of the research team turned, raising their own glasses in a joyous, uncoordinated cheer. Elijah clapped me hard on the shoulder, grinning from ear to ear. He didn't say a word, but the shared understanding in his eyes spoke volumes. We had survived the grueling late nights. We had survived the crushing academic pressure. We had won. To Joshua Davis, Dr. Gray announced, his voice cutting through the celebratory chatter of the grand reception hall. He held his glass high, looking at me with absolute pride. A researcher who proves that the most resilient elements in the universe are the ones forged under the highest pressure. I raised my glass, touching the delicate crystal against his with a soft, ringing chime. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the chilled champagne. The crisp, bright taste danced on my tongue. I looked around the reception area at the faces of my chosen family. They did not care about my suburban pedigree. They did not care about my neighborhood status or my bank account. They cared about my sharp mind, my relentless work ethic, and my unyielding dedication to the truth. People often ask me in the comment sections of these stories if I harbor any residual guilt. They ask if a tiny part of my conscience aches for walking away from my parents when they lost their home, their retirement, and their coveted social standing. They wonder if establishing such a rigid boundary makes me just as cold as the father who handed me an auto-detailing brochure and told me I was a failure. I can tell you with unwavering certainty that I do not feel a single drop of guilt. Guilt is an emotion reserved exclusively for those who cause unjust harm. I did not cause their catastrophic bankruptcy. I did not force my brother to drop out of a prestigious university and launch a fraudulent business venture. I did not force my father to leverage his entire life savings to maintain a fake image at a country club. I merely refused to be the designated lifeboat for a sinking ship I was never invited to board. Setting a boundary is not an act of bitter revenge. It is an act of profound self-preservation. Revenge requires you to invest your precious energy into causing someone else pain. Purpose requires you to invest your energy into building your own enduring joy. I chose purpose. I chose to take the staggering financial reward of my cellular discovery and funnel it directly into the Joshua Davis Foundation. Every single year, our trust writes substantial tuition checks for brilliant, disadvantaged young men and women. We buy their expensive textbooks. We fund their mandatory laboratory fees. We provide safe housing stipends. We ensure that no aspiring scientist ever has to scrub custom rims or breathe in toxic degreaser for 9 hours a day just to afford a basic community college chemistry class. We ensure that when a toxic voice tells them they are not smart enough for science, They have a heavily funded institution standing right behind them saying, "Yes, you are." That is my true legacy. It is not a legacy of bitter vindication against my family. It is a legacy of empowerment for the next generation. I stood in that golden reception hall surrounded by the brilliant minds who had chosen to mentor and support me. I took another sip of my champagne and took a deep, steadying breath. I looked at the incredible reality I had constructed from the ashes of their rejection. Success truly is the ultimate response to toxicity. Because when you build a life overflowing with authentic purpose, the opinions of the people who tried to break you simply cease to exist. They become fading ghosts haunting a past you no longer inhabit. And this brings me to the most important thing I want to share with all of you today. The profound lesson woven throughout this journey is that your inherent worth and your ultimate potential are never dictated by the arbitrary limitations or cruel projections that broken people attempt to force upon you, even when those people happen to be your own biological family. When you are faced with an environment that actively funds illusions while starving your truths, the most powerful response is not to stay and fight a losing battle for a seat at a table where you are fundamentally disrespected. The true victory is to bravely walk away, endure the grueling isolation, and quietly build your own table from the ground up. Loyalty is the true currency of family. You are under no obligation to act as a financial or emotional life raft for the very individuals who once tried to drown your ambitions to protect their fragile egos. You possess the absolute power to choose your community, define your legacy, and write an ending where you thrive on your own terms. If you believe that true family is based on respect and mutual loyalty, and if you agree that walking away from toxicity is a sign of immense strength rather than cruelty, I want you to comment the word "good" down below, or share your own perspective on what setting boundaries has taught you. It lets me know that you value these lessons and that my story has resonated with you. Thank you for listening, and always remember that you alone hold the pen to your future.